Stupid man smirks after trying to hurt lawyer, then judge makes him instantly regret it. The morning sun cast long shadows through the Venetian blinds of Rachel Bennett's office as she studied the lawsuit papers spread across her mahogany desk. Her fingers drummed against the polished wood as she read the name again, Greg Turner vs. Westland Industries. The corners of her mouth tightened as she recognized the plaintiff's name. It wasn't the first time she'd heard it in legal circles. "Ms. Bennett?" Her assistant Sarah poked her head through the door. "Mr. Davidson from Westland Industries is here for the meeting." Rachel nodded, gathering the papers into a neat pile. As the CEO of Westland Industries entered her office, she could see the worry lines etched deeply into his face. James Davidson was a self-made man who'd built his company from the ground up over 30 years. Now, he faced a lawsuit that could potentially cost his company millions. "Tell me everything you know about this Greg Turner," Rachel said, gesturing for Davidson to take a seat. Davidson sank into the leather chair, his shoulders slumping. "He claims he slipped and fell in our warehouse 3 months ago. Says he suffered severe spinal injuries, trauma to his legs, and can barely walk now. He's asking for $2.5 million in damages." Rachel flipped through her notes. "And your security cameras?" "That's the thing. He claims it happened in a blind spot. The timing couldn't be worse. We were updating our security system that week, and there were some gaps in coverage." Rachel leaned back, her mind already racing through possibilities. She'd heard whispers about Greg Turner before, a man who'd filed similar lawsuits against 4 other companies in the past 5 years. Each time, the companies had settled out of court, finding it cheaper than a prolonged legal battle. But something about this case made her instincts tingle. The next day, Rachel sat across from Greg Turner and his attorney in the conference room. Turner wore a neck brace and leaned heavily on a sleek black cane, wincing dramatically with every slight movement. But it was his eyes that caught Rachel's attention, sharp, calculating, and entirely too alert for someone supposedly suffering from severe trauma. "Mr. Turner," Rachel began, her voice professionally neutral. "Could you walk us through the events of March 15th again?" Turner shifted in his seat, one hand massaging his neck. "Like I said in my statement, I was making a delivery to Warehouse B. The floor was wet, no warning signs, mind you, and I slipped. Fell hard on my back. The pain." He closed his eyes, his face contorting. "The pain was unlike anything I've ever experienced." But as he spoke, Rachel noticed something odd. His story matched his written statement almost word for word, too perfectly, as if rehearsed. Most genuine accident victims showed some variation in their retelling, added details they'd forgotten, or remembered things differently. Turner's account was like a memorized script. "And you're certain it was Warehouse B?" Rachel pressed, keeping her tone casual while watching his reactions carefully. "Absolutely," Turner replied without hesitation. "I remember everything clearly." Rachel made a note, hiding her satisfaction. Warehouse B had been closed for renovation that entire week, a fact she discovered during her preliminary investigation. As the meeting concluded, Turner rose slowly, making a show of struggling with his cane. But just before he turned to leave, Rachel caught something that made her blood run cold, a smirk. Quick and subtle, but unmistakable. It was the expression of a man who thought he'd already won. Later that evening, Rachel sat alone in her office, surrounded by case files and precedents. Her computer screen glowed with Turner's litigation history, the previous lawsuits, the settlements, the pattern that was beginning to emerge. On paper, everything looked legitimate. His medical records showed severe injuries, his witness statements aligned perfectly, and his timing with the security camera blind spot was unfortunately perfect. But Rachel Bennett hadn't become one of the city's most formidable attorneys by accepting things at face value. As she stared at Turner's smirking face in his driver's license photo, she made a decision. Unlike the other companies, Westland Industries wouldn't roll over and settle. This time, Greg Turner had picked the wrong target. She reached for her phone and dialed the number. "John? It's Rachel Bennett. Remember that favor you owe me? I need your best private investigator. We're going to do some very detailed surveillance. She paused, a determined smile spreading across her face. And John? Tell them to pay special attention to how our friend Mr. Turner spends his weekends when he thinks no one's watching. The game was on, and Rachel Bennett was playing to win. As she began outlining her strategy, she couldn't help but think that Turner's confident smirk might not last much longer. Sometimes, the most satisfying victories came from letting your opponent believe they had the upper hand, right until the moment you showed your cards. The medical records spread across Rachel's desk seemed impeccable at first glance. Dr. Thomas Walker, a respected neurologist, had documented Greg Turner's injuries in meticulous detail: severe spinal trauma, nerve damage, and chronic pain that would likely result in permanent disability. But something about the paperwork nagged at Rachel's instincts. "Sarah," she called to her assistant, "can you get me Dr. Walker's office on the line?" 20 minutes later, Rachel's suspicions deepened. Dr. Walker's receptionist confirmed he'd been at a medical conference in Switzerland during the dates he'd supposedly examined Turner. When Rachel cross-referenced the medical center's address on Turner's documents, she discovered it was actually a defunct urgent care clinic that had closed 2 years ago. "The question is," Rachel muttered to herself, "how did he get such convincing forgeries?" The security footage Turner had submitted showed him entering Westland Industries' warehouse, then cut to him lying on the ground in apparent agony. Rachel watched it frame by frame, her eyes narrowing as she noticed subtle inconsistencies. The timestamp in the corner flickered slightly between scenes, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. John's private investigator, Mike Chen, entered with a thick folder. "You're going to want to see this," Mike said, pulling out several photographs. "Remember that witness statement from Maria Rodriguez? The cleaning lady who supposedly saw Turner fall?" Rachel nodded. Maria's testimony had been particularly compelling, full of specific details about Turner's accident. "Well, here's Maria leaving a coffee shop last week," Mike continued, laying down a photo. "And here she is accepting an envelope from our friend Mr. Turner." Rachel examined the pictures, her jaw tightening. "How many other witnesses has he paid off?" "We've identified 3 so far. But here's where it gets interesting." Mike pulled out more surveillance photos. "See this man here? He's a former video editor who worked in special effects. He met with Turner 4 times in the week before the lawsuit was filed." The pieces were starting to fit together. Rachel reached for Turner's medical records again, this time looking not at the content but at the paper itself. Under her desk's UV light, she spotted what she'd been hoping for: tiny serial numbers in the corner. These weren't ordinary medical forms, they were high-quality forgeries. As Rachel dug deeper, she discovered a pattern in Turner's methodology. He always chose companies during periods of transition or upgrade, times when security might be compromised or records might be confused. His timing with Westland Industries' security system update hadn't been luck, it had been calculated. Later that afternoon, Rachel observed Turner arriving for his deposition. He made a show of struggling with his cane, his face contorted in apparent pain. But as he passed the building's reflective windows, Rachel noticed something odd. His reflection showed perfect posture for a split second before he remembered to slump. During the deposition, Turner's performance was almost flawless. He described his injuries with just the right mixture of frustration and resignation. His voice trembled appropriately when discussing how the accident had affected his life. But Rachel noticed he kept touching his neck brace, not in pain, but almost as if he was making sure it was positioned correctly for maximum effect. "Mr. Turner," Rachel began, keeping her voice neutral, "could you describe the pain you experience on a daily basis?" "It's excruciating," Turner replied, wincing. "Some days I can barely get out of bed. The doctors say I might never work again. And the pain is constant?" "Yes, especially in my lower back and legs. Even sitting here now is agonizing." Rachel nodded sympathetically while making notes. What Turner didn't know was that her team had already established his morning routine, including his regular tennis matches at a private club outside the city. That evening, Rachel met with James Davidson to update him on the case. "He's good," she admitted. His forgeries are professional quality, his witnesses are well rehearsed, and he knows exactly how to play to a jury's sympathies. But he's made one crucial mistake. What's that? Davidson asked. He's gotten overconfident. Every scam artist has a tell, a moment when they can't resist showing their hand. Turner's is his smirk. He thinks he's untouchable because he's gotten away with this before. But this time, we're going to let him build his house of cards just a little higher before we pull out the foundation. Rachel turned to her computer and pulled up a calendar. The trial starts next week. Turner thinks he has us cornered with his medical records, his witnesses, and his performance. He's expecting us to offer a settlement any day now. She smiled grimly. Instead, we're going to give him enough rope to hang himself. As she drove home that night, Rachel's mind raced with possibilities. Turner's evidence was fake, but proving it in court would require more than just suspicion. She needed something concrete, something undeniable. The timestamps on the security footage were suspicious, but not conclusive. The witness payments could be explained away as charitable giving. The medical records. Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as an idea struck her. If Turner had used the same forger for his medical records as he had in his previous scams, there might be a pattern. She made a mental note to check the paper stock and printing characteristics of documentation from his other lawsuits. The next morning, Rachel arrived at her office early, energized despite the long night. As she watched the sunrise paint the city skyline, she knew she was getting closer to unraveling Turner's scheme. His smug confidence had led him to make mistakes, and Rachel Bennett was very, very good at finding mistakes. She picked up a photo of Turner wearing his neck brace and studied it carefully. "Game on, Mr. Turner," she murmured. "Let's see how well you perform when the spotlight gets a little hotter." The courthouse buzzed with tension on the third day of the trial. Rachel Bennett sat at the defense table, watching Greg Turner hobble to the witness stand. His performance had been impeccable so far, each wince, each labored step carefully calculated to elicit maximum sympathy from the jury. Judge Martha Sullivan, a veteran of the bench known for her no-nonsense approach, looked on with growing concern as Turner struggled to climb the 2 steps to the witness box. Rachel noticed how the jury members leaned forward, their faces etched with sympathy. An elderly woman in the front row even dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "Mr. Turner," Turner's attorney, Marcus Wells, began in a practiced, compassionate tone. "Please tell the court about the ongoing impact of your injuries." Turner shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his neck brace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The pain, it's constant. Some days I can't even tie my own shoes." His voice cracked perfectly. "My life has been completely destroyed by Westland Industries' negligence." Rachel maintained her composed expression, but internally, she had to admire Turner's theatrical skills. He was hitting every emotional note with precision. As she glanced at the jury, she could see several members nodding sympathetically. Then it happened. As Turner reached for the water glass on the witness stand, his hand appeared to tremble. The glass tipped, spilling water across the polished wooden surface. Turner lurched forward, supposedly trying to prevent the spill, and suddenly lost his balance. What followed was a masterclass in staged accidents. Turner's fall from the witness stand appeared both spectacular and horrifyingly realistic. His cane clattered across the floor as he tumbled, landing with a convincing thud that echoed through the stunned courtroom. "My back!" he cried out, his voice raw with apparent agony. "Oh God, my back!" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Sullivan banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Several jury members half rose from their seats, hands covering their mouths in shock. Marcus Wells rushed to his client's side, calling for medical assistance. "Your Honor," Wells declared dramatically, "my client needs immediate medical attention. This fall could have severely exacerbated his existing injuries." Rachel watched as Turner writhed on the floor, his performance hitting every mark perfectly. But then she caught it, that flash of satisfaction in his eyes, the ghost of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth when he thought no one was looking. Judge Sullivan, despite her usual skepticism, appeared genuinely concerned. Mr. Turner, don't move. We'll get medical help right away. Bailiff, please call for an ambulance. The court medic arrived first, kneeling beside Turner as he moaned convincingly. Rachel observed how Turner subtly positioned himself to face the jury, ensuring they could see every grimace of pain. Your Honor, Wells addressed the court, his voice trembling with well-practiced concern. Given this unfortunate development, I move for an immediate recess to assess my client's condition. Judge Sullivan nodded, her face grave. Motion granted. Court will recess until tomorrow morning, pending Mr. Turner's medical evaluation. As paramedics entered with a stretcher, Rachel noticed something that others missed. Turner's neck brace had shifted slightly during his fall, revealing unmarked, healthy skin beneath, skin that should have shown signs of long-term brace wear if his injuries were genuine. Rachel stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. Your Honor, before we recess, the defense would like to make a motion. Turner, now being helped onto the stretcher, froze momentarily. Rachel caught another flash of that smirk. He thought she was about to offer a settlement, just like all the others before her. The defense would like to present new evidence tomorrow morning, evidence that has become particularly relevant given today's events. Judge Sullivan raised an eyebrow. New evidence, Ms. Bennett? Yes, Your Honor. Surveillance footage that I believe will be most illuminating. For a fraction of a second, Turner's confident expression wavered. Rachel watched as he quickly reassembled his mask of pain, but she'd seen it, that flicker of uncertainty, the first crack in his perfectly constructed facade. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Rachel remained at her table, organizing her files. She could hear the whispers of the departing spectators, their conversations full of sympathy for Turner and criticism of Westland Industries' apparent callousness. Marcus Wells approached her desk, his expression smug. Rachel, let's be reasonable here. After today's unfortunate incident, your client's position has become untenable. Why don't we discuss a settlement? Rachel looked up at him, her expression pleasantly neutral. I don't think so, Marcus. But I would strongly advise both you and your client to be present in court tomorrow morning. It's going to be quite educational. As Wells walked away, Rachel pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Mike Chin. Everything ready for tomorrow? The response came immediately. All set. He won't know what hit him. Rachel packed up her briefcase, her mind already running through tomorrow's strategy. Turner's courtroom performance had been masterful, perhaps too masterful. In his eagerness to cement his victory, he'd given her exactly what she needed. As she left the courthouse, she passed a group of reporters interviewing Turner's attorney. Wells was playing to the cameras, describing his clients. Devastating new injuries. And Westland Industries. Callous disregard for worker safety. Rachel smiled to herself. Let them have their moment in the spotlight. Tomorrow would bring a very different kind of exposure, and Greg Turner's smirk wouldn't survive it. The next morning, the courtroom was packed to capacity. News of Turner's dramatic fall had spread, drawing reporters and curious onlookers. Turner sat at the plaintiff's table, looking appropriately distressed in a new, more elaborate neck brace, with the addition of a wheelchair, an upgrade from his previous cane. Rachel noticed how he periodically shifted in his wheelchair, ensuring his discomfort was visible to the jury. She also noticed how his attorney, Marcus Wells, kept glancing at her with barely concealed triumph. They thought today would be their victory lap. Your Honor, Rachel began, rising from her seat. The defense would like to present new evidence that has recently come to light. Judge Sullivan nodded. Proceed, Ms. Bennett. Rachel moved to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking purposefully on the hardwood floor. Yesterday, we all witnessed Mr. Turner's unfortunate accident in this very courtroom. Today, I would like to show the court some footage from Westland Industries, captured on the day of Mr. Turner's alleged initial injury. Turner's face remained carefully composed, but Rachel caught the slight tightening around his eyes. She gestured to the court technician, who dimmed the lights and activated the large display screen. This first clip is from the warehouse's external security camera, Rachel explained. The footage showed Turner's delivery truck arriving at Westland Industries. Please note the timestamp, 2:15 p.m., the exact time Mr. Turner claims his accident occurred. The courtroom watched as Turner emerged from his truck, checking his phone. Then something unexpected happened in the video. He looked directly at the security camera, studied it for a moment, then moved to a different entrance. "No," Rachel continued. "Mr. Turner claimed there were no working cameras in the area where he fell. But what he didn't know was that Westland Industries had installed temporary construction cameras during their security system upgrade." She nodded to the technician again. The next clip showed Turner in the supposedly camera-blind spot. He looked around carefully, then took something from his pocket, a small bottle of liquid. The courtroom gasped as they watched him deliberately pour it on the floor, wait a few moments, then execute a perfectly choreographed fall. "Your Honor!" Wells jumped to his feet. "This is obviously doctored footage. We were never informed of these cameras' existence during discovery." "If I may," Rachel countered smoothly. "I have here the certification from the security company that installed these temporary cameras, along with the chain of custody documentation for this footage. But perhaps more interesting is what our investigation uncovered about Mr. Turner's activities outside of Westland Industries." The next video began playing. It showed Turner, early yesterday morning, walking briskly into a private gym. There was no cane, no neck brace, no sign of any injury. The timestamp showed it was just 2 hours before his courtroom performance. "Objection!" Wells shouted. "This is a clear invasion of privacy." "Overruled," Judge Sullivan stated firmly, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Continue, Ms. Bennett." Rachel played one final clip, surveillance footage from the courthouse parking garage, taken just before yesterday's proceedings. It showed Turner arriving in his car, pulling his neck brace and cane from the trunk, carefully arranging them, and practicing his limp before entering the building. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notepads, transfixed by the unfolding revelations. "Your Honor," Rachel addressed the judge, "I would also like to submit these photographs into evidence." She held up several clear images. "These show Mr. Turner engaging in various activities over the past month, playing tennis, moving furniture at his home, and even participating in a local basketball game. All while supposedly suffering from debilitating injuries." Turner's facade finally cracked. The practiced look of pain disappeared, replaced by barely contained rage. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Turner brushed him off. "This is all a setup," Turner declared, suddenly rising from his wheelchair. Several jury members gasped at his miraculous recovery. Realizing his mistake, he quickly slumped back down, but the damage was done. "Furthermore," Rachel continued, maintaining her professional composure despite the satisfaction coursing through her, "we have evidence that Mr. Turner has orchestrated similar fraudulent claims against other companies. The defense would like to call our next witness, Mr. David Chin, a former video editor who was hired by Mr. Turner to doctor security footage for previous lawsuits." Turner's face had lost all color. His hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smirk that had played on his lips throughout the trial was nowhere to be seen. "Your Honor," Wells attempted to interrupt. "We request a brief recess to review this new evidence." "Denied," Judge Sullivan replied sharply, her expression thunderous. She turned to Turner. Mr. Turner, approach the bench immediately. Turner hesitated, trapped in his own deception. If he walked normally, he would confirm his fraud. If he maintained his act, he would appear ridiculous in light of the evidence. Finally, with all eyes in the courtroom upon him, Turner stood up. The neck brace suddenly looked absurd against his straight posture and easy movements as he walked to the bench. The elderly juror who had been dabbing her eyes yesterday now looked at him with undisguised disgust. Rachel gathered her documents, knowing she didn't need to say anything more. The evidence spoke for itself. As she watched Turner standing before Judge Sullivan, his elaborate scheme crumbling around him, she thought about all the companies he had successfully scammed before, all the legitimate injury claims that people would view with skepticism because of frauds like him. The game was over, and Turner's confident smirk had been replaced by something else entirely. The look of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse, knowing that this time, there would be no settlement, no easy escape, and no one left to fool. Judge Sullivan's face had turned a shade of red that Rachel had never seen in her 15 years of practicing law. The judge removed her glasses slowly, fixing Turner with a stare that could have melted steel. "Mr. Turner," Judge Sullivan's voice cut through the courtroom like a razor. "In my 30 years on the bench, I have seen many attempts to deceive this court. But rarely have I witnessed such a calculated, elaborate, and shameless fraud as you have perpetrated here." Turner shifted uncomfortably, his confident demeanor completely evaporated. The wheelchair sat abandoned by the plaintiff's table, a prop in a play that had reached an unexpected final act. "Your Honor, I can explain," Turner began, but Judge Sullivan's raised hand silenced him instantly. "Oh, you'll have plenty of time to explain, Mr. Turner. But not to me." She turned to her clerk. "Please contact the district attorney's office immediately. I want their fraud division here within the hour." The clerk nodded and hurried out. Turner's attorney, Marcus Wells, had begun packing his briefcase, distancing himself from his client both literally and figuratively. "Your Honor," Rachel stood. "Westland Industries moves for an immediate dismissal of this case with prejudice." "Granted," Judge Sullivan declared without hesitation. "But we're not done here." She turned back to Turner, who had begun to sweat visibly. "Mr. Turner, you are hereby held in direct contempt of court. Additionally, I am referring this matter for criminal prosecution on charges of perjury, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The bailiff moved closer to Turner, who suddenly seemed to realize the gravity of his situation. The smirk that had been his constant companion throughout the trial was replaced by an expression of genuine panic. "You don't understand," Turner pleaded, his voice losing its practiced tone of suffering. "Those companies, they can afford." "Silence!" Judge Sullivan's gavel crack echoed through the courtroom. "You have repeatedly and willfully made a mockery of this court. You have wasted judicial resources, attempted to defraud a legitimate business, and most egregiously, you have damaged the credibility of every person who comes before this court with genuine injuries." Rachel noticed several reporters scribbling frantically in their notepads. This would make headlines tomorrow, but not the ones Turner had been hoping for. "Furthermore," the judge continued, her voice growing colder, "I am ordering a full investigation into all your previous lawsuits and settlements. Every company you've targeted, every dollar you've fraudulently obtained, it will all be examined in excruciating detail." Turner's legs seemed to give way, and he had to grip the podium to stay upright. This time, his weakness wasn't an act. "Your Honor," he tried again, his voice trembling, "I have children to support." "How dare you!" Judge Sullivan's voice thundered through the courtroom. "You would invoke your children while standing here, having just been exposed as a professional liar and fraudster? Bailiff, take him into custody." As the bailiff approached with handcuffs, Turner's composure completely shattered. Gone was the confident scam artist who had walked into court expecting another easy payday. In his place stood a man facing the consequences of his actions for the first time. "Wait, please!" Turner called out desperately. "I'll pay it back. I'll make it right." "Mr. Turner," Judge Sullivan's voice dripped with contempt, "you seem to be under the impression that this is a negotiation. It is not." "Bailiff, proceed." The click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Rachel watched as reality finally set in for Turner. His face, once smugly confident, now showed nothing but fear and regret. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Sullivan turned to Rachel, "I commend you and your team for your thorough investigation. Please ensure that all evidence is properly transferred to the district attorney's office." Rachel nodded, gathering her files. "Yes, Your Honor. Westland Industries will cooperate fully with any investigation." As Turner was led away, Rachel caught a glimpse of his face. The mask of injury and suffering had completely fallen away, replaced by the stark terror of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. Judge Sullivan had one final pronouncement. Let the record show that this court is imposing sanctions on Mr. Turner in the amount of $500,000, payable to Westland Industries for legal fees and damages. Additionally, Mr. Turner is hereby barred from filing any civil lawsuits in this jurisdiction without prior court approval. The spectators in the courtroom buzzed with conversation as Turner was escorted out. Rachel noticed several of the jury members nodding in satisfaction at the judge's harsh response. Just before he disappeared through the door to the holding cells, Turner looked back at the courtroom one last time. His eyes met Rachel's, and in that moment, she saw something she'd been waiting for since the case began: complete and utter defeat. Marcus Wells, Turner's attorney, approached Rachel as the courtroom began to empty. "I want to state for the record that I had no knowledge of my client's deception," he said, his face ashen. Rachel gave him a long, measured look. "Save it for the Bar Association, Marcus. They'll be very interested in hearing how you missed all the red flags in your client's case." As the last spectators filed out, Rachel began packing her briefcase. James Davidson, CEO of Westland Industries, approached her with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "You've saved more than just my company. You've stopped him from doing this to anyone else." Rachel smiled, thinking of all the hours of investigation, the late nights reviewing footage, the meticulous gathering of evidence. "Justice may not always be swift, Mr. Davidson, but when it arrives, it can be quite thorough." Outside the courtroom, reporters had already gathered, hungry for details of the dramatic conclusion. But Rachel's mind was already moving forward, thinking about the coming criminal proceedings and the task of unraveling Turner's web of fraudulent lawsuits. The smirk was gone, and this time, it wouldn't be coming back. 2 weeks after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Rachel sat in her office, reviewing the morning newspapers. The headlines splashed across every major publication told the story of Greg Turner's downfall in vivid detail. Serial lawsuit fraudster exposed, decades of deception uncovered, fake injuries, real crimes, the fall of Greg Turner, justice served, how one attorney unveiled $1 million scam operation. The investigation triggered by Judge Sullivan's ruling had opened a Pandora's box of fraudulent activities. 6 other companies came forward, revealing they had settled similar lawsuits with Turner over the past decade. The total amount of his ill-gotten gains exceeded $12 million. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Mike Chin. "Just got word from the DA's office. Turner's bail was denied. They found evidence he was planning to flee the country." A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah entered with a stack of letters. "These came for you today. Mostly from other companies wanting to hire you for fraud cases." Rachel picked up one of the envelopes, noting the return address of a major corporation. Word had spread quickly through the business community about how she had exposed Turner's scheme. But it was another letter that caught her attention, one from a small family-owned business that had settled with Turner 2 years ago. "Dear Ms. Bennett," the letter began. "When Turner sued our company, we couldn't afford a lengthy legal battle. The settlement nearly bankrupted us. Thanks to your exposure of his fraud, we now have a chance to recover what we lost. You've given hope to many who thought justice was beyond their reach." The news coverage had sparked a broader conversation about fraudulent lawsuits and their impact on businesses. Several state legislators were now pushing for stronger penalties for lawsuit fraud and better protections for companies targeted by professional scammers. Later that afternoon, Rachel attended a meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor, Amanda Chin, shared the latest developments. "Turner's former accomplices are turning on him," Amanda explained, spreading photographs across her desk. "His medical records forger, the paid witnesses, even his previous attorneys, they're all cooperating to save themselves." "How many cases are we looking at?" Rachel asked. "We've identified 28 fraudulent lawsuits over the past 12 years. Turner didn't just target big corporations, he went after small businesses too, knowing they'd be more likely to settle quickly." The investigation had also uncovered Turner's luxury condo in Miami, 3 sports cars, and offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, all purchased with money from his fraudulent settlements. Everything was being seized and would be used to compensate his victims. Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Breaking. Insurance industry launches task force against lawsuit fraud, cites Turner case as wake-up call. The impact of the case had extended far beyond one fraudster's downfall. Insurance companies were implementing new protocols to identify potential fraud patterns. Legal organizations were offering workshops to help attorneys spot signs of professional scammers. That evening, Rachel received an unexpected visitor, Judge Sullivan. "Ms. Bennett," the judge said, settling into a chair in Rachel's office. "Your handling of the Turner case has set a new standard for fraud investigation. The Judicial Council is recommending your methods as a model for similar cases." Rachel nodded modestly. Turner got careless because he'd never been challenged. He thought his act was foolproof. Speaking of Turner, Judge Sullivan continued, "He's agreed to a plea deal. 20 years in federal prison, full restitution to all victims, and he has to record a public service announcement about lawsuit fraud." Rachel couldn't help but smile at the irony. The man who had made a career out of performing for cameras would make one final appearance, this time telling the truth. As she prepared to leave the office that night, Rachel received one last email. It was from James Davidson at Westland Industries, sharing a company-wide announcement. They were establishing a legal defense fund for small businesses targeted by fraudulent lawsuits, named in her honor. The Bennett Initiative for Legal Justice. Walking to her car, Rachel reflected on the case's ripple effects. Turner's downfall had done more than expose one man's crimes. It had highlighted a larger issue and sparked genuine change in how the legal system handled fraud cases. The evening news played on her car radio as she drove home. In following up on the Turner fraud case, investigators have uncovered a network of professional lawsuit scammers operating across multiple states. The FBI has launched a nationwide task force. Rachel smiled, thinking of Turner sitting in his cell, his confident smirk replaced by the knowledge that his actions had not only destroyed his own life but had also led to the dismantling of an entire network of fraud. The final piece of justice came the next morning. Rachel opened her email to find a message from the Bar Association. They were presenting her with their annual Ethics and Practice Award, citing her work on the Turner case as a testament to the power of dedicated legal professionals in protecting the integrity of our justice system. As she closed her laptop, Rachel thought about all the genuine injury victims who would now have a better chance at justice because one fraudster's smirk had finally been wiped away. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest victories weren't just about winning a case. They were about changing the system for the better. The story of Greg Turner's downfall would be taught in law schools as a cautionary tale, but Rachel knew it would be remembered for something more important, as proof that justice, though sometimes slow, was worth fighting for, and that one person's dedication to truth could ripple out to protect countless others. The smirk was gone, and in its place stood something far more valuable: hope for all those who still believed in justice.